Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling tales ever carried by the icy winds of Ohio between its silent hills. Before we proceed, please share in the comments where in the world you are watching from, because stories like this are meant to be shared around an invisible campfire that connects us even through screens. This video is a fictional work created solely for entertainment. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, is purely coincidental. Now, picture this with me. The year is 1912. Winter has just loosened its grip on Ashland County in the heart of Ohio, and spring is beginning to emerge with the damp scent of earth finally breathing after months beneath the snow. The dirt roads still hold muddy puddles, and wagon wheels leave deep ruts that resemble scars in the soil. It is within this setting that our story begins on an isolated rural property, surrounded by a grove of twisted oak trees, a place locals simply called Hollow Woods. The farm belonged to a man named Elias Thornwood, a reserved individual who had moved to the region just over a decade prior. No one knew exactly where Elias came from. Some whispered he had fled a scandal in Pittsburgh. Others swore he was a former professor from an Eastern university who lost everything in poor wagers. The truth was that Elias cultivated his mystery with the same care he devoted to his corn and his silence. The Thornwood estate was known in the area for a peculiar reason. There stood an old barn, constructed decades before Elias's arrival, which possessed strange architecture. The roof was unusually sloped, almost as if designed to deflect something other than rain. The windows were too small, more like observation slits than openings for light and air. And there was a back door perpetually locked with heavy chains that seemed excessively robust for merely securing farm tools. The nearest neighbors, the Whitmore family, lived about 3 kilometers away on a modest dairy farm. Margaret Whitmore was a naturally curious woman, one of those people who observe everything and memorize every detail with razor-sharp memory. She often told her husband Theodore that something was amiss with the Thornwood property. It wasn't just Elias's oddness or the sinister barn. It was something more subtle, harder to define. It was the way birds avoided landing in the nearby trees. It was the absolute silence that hung over that land, even on the sunniest days. Theodore, a practical man with little patience for superstition, would always dismiss his wife's concerns with a wave of his hand. Lonely farmers were common in Ohio, he'd say. Not everyone desires company. Not everyone needs to explain their life. But Margaret could not ignore what her eyes caught on the rare occasions she passed near the Thornwood property. She saw lights in the barn at odd hours, long after midnight. She heard muffled sounds carried by the wind, sounds that didn't resemble any animal she knew. It was on one such March night in 1912 that something definitively shifted in Margaret's perception of that place. She had awakened thirsty and risen to fetch water. As she passed the kitchen window, her gaze automatically turned toward Thornwood Farm, a habit she had developed without realizing it, and then she saw it. An orange light pulsed within the barn, too bright to be a simple oil lamp, and against that light, projected like a macabre theatrical shadow, was a silhouette moving erratically, gesturing toward something or someone Margaret could not distinguish. She stood there paralyzed, empty glass in hand, watching that grim spectacle for long minutes. The silhouette ceased moving abruptly, as if it had felt the weight of Margaret's gaze piercing the distance. Then, the light vanished, the barn plunged into complete darkness, and Margaret felt a shiver trace her spine. One of those whispered warnings from ancestral instinct. The following morning, she decided she could no longer keep her concerns to herself. She needed to speak with someone who could investigate, someone with authority. And that is how the Ashland County Sheriff, a man named Wallace Brennan, first heard the name Thornwood, associated with something beyond mere rural eccentricity. What he would discover in the coming weeks would transform that spring of 1912 into the darkest season the county had ever known. Sheriff Wallace Brennan was a 53-year-old man with a graying mustache he constantly stroked while in thought. He had served as sheriff of Ashland County for nearly 15 years, and in that time had seen a bit of everything. Tavern brawls, cattle rustling, land disputes ending in gunfights. Yet there was something in Margaret Whitmore's account that stirred a different unease within him, a mental itch he could not ignore. That March morning, seated in his office in the center of the small town of Ashland, Brennan listened as Margaret described what she had witnessed. The woman spoke with her hands, gesturing to give shape to the shadow she had seen projected against the orange light. Her eyes held that particular expression of someone who had lost sleep over persistent thoughts. The sheriff took notes in a worn notebook, more from habit than necessity, while his mind already plotted his next steps. Brennan knew Elias Thornwood by sight. Everyone in the county did, if only superficially. The man appeared in town once a month, always on the same dates, to buy supplies at Samuel Hendrick's general store. He purchased flour, salt, kerosene, rope, nails, basic items for any farmer. He always paid in cash, never spoke beyond what was strictly necessary, and disappeared back to his property before the sun reached its zenith. No one had formal complaints against him. No one had concrete reasons for distrust. Only that vague feeling people like Margaret felt, that nameless intuition whispering warnings. Reason cannot explain. The sheriff decided an informal visit would be the first step. No accusations, no confrontations, just a conversation between neighbors, a law officer checking on the well-being of an isolated resident. It was spring, after all. Time to check fences, to verify winter hadn't caused damage to more remote properties. A perfectly plausible excuse. 2 days later, on a cloudy Thursday, Brennan mounted his brown horse and rode along the dirt road leading to Thornwood Farm. The path wound between gentle hills still covered in grass, yellowed by the recent winter. Crows watched him pass from bare branches, their heads tilted with that sinister curiosity characteristic of the species. The sheriff wasn't a superstitious man, but he admitted to himself there was something oppressive about that landscape, something that seemed to leach color and life from the surroundings. When he sighted the Thornwood estate, Brennan instinctively slowed his horse. The farm was larger than he had imagined, sprawling across a shallow valley surrounded by the gnarled oak trees Margaret had mentioned. The main house was a 2-story structure with wooden walls darkened by time, and windows that resembled half-closed eyes watching his approach. The infamous barn stood about 100 meters from the house, partially hidden by a rise in the terrain. From there, Brennan could only see the strangely sloped roof, exactly as Mrs. Whitmore had described. There was no sign of movement, no smoke from the chimney, no animals in the empty corrals. The silence was so absolute, Brennan could hear his own heart pounding against his ribs. He dismounted, tied his horse to a nearby fence, and walked to the house's porch. His boots made the wooden planks creak with each step, announcing his presence in a way impossible to ignore. He knocked 3 times. The sound echoed inside and died without an answer. Brennan waited a full minute, mentally counting seconds before knocking again. Nothing. He approached a window and tried to peer through the dusty glass. The interior was shrouded in twilight, but he could make out furniture covered in white sheets, like ghosts frozen in waiting poses. A thick layer of dust coated every visible surface. The house looked abandoned for weeks, perhaps months, but that made no sense. Samuel Hendrick had confirmed Elias had been at his store less than 2 weeks prior, buying his usual supplies. The man had to be somewhere on the property. Brennan stepped off the porch and walked toward the barn, his investigative instincts now fully alert. As he approached, unsettling details began to reveal themselves. The main barn doors were ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. The ground around them was marked by deep footprints in the mud, footprints that seemed to go back and forth in erratic patterns without clear direction. And there was an odor in the air, subtle but unmistakable. A sweet metallic smell that made the sheriff's stomach clench. He stopped a few feet from the entrance, his hand automatically resting on his revolver's holster. The light of the cloudy day barely penetrated the darkness inside. Brennan took a box of matches from his pocket and lit one. The small flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. What he saw in those first few seconds made his blood run cold. The interior of the barn had been completely modified. Where there should have been animal stalls and space for equipment, there was now a series of makeshift structures resembling compartments or cells. Chains hung from the ceiling beams. Strange symbols were scrawled on the walls with what looked like charcoal or dark ink. And in the center of it all stood a large table covered with a stained cloth, surrounded by instruments Brennan could not identify in the match's dim light. The match burned his fingers and went out. The sheriff stood in the sudden darkness, breath held, heart pounding in his ears. He needed to return to town. He needed reinforcements, proper lights, trustworthy men. Whatever was happening at Thornwood Farm was far beyond what a simple informal visit could address, and Elias, wherever he was, had much to explain. Sheriff Wallace Brennan rode back to town at a pace bordering on desperation. His chestnut horse sensed the rider's tension and responded with nervous strides, ears twitching back as if it too sensed something terrible had been discovered on that silent farm. The March sky remained gray, heavy with low clouds that seemed to press the world down, suffocating the landscape under a cloak of melancholy. When he arrived at the county office, Brennan had already mentally planned his next steps. He needed at least 3 trustworthy men, enough lanterns to illuminate every corner of that cursed barn, and perhaps a doctor to examine whatever they found inside. His rational mind struggled to process the fragmented images captured in the match's flicker. The chains, the symbols, that central table with its stained cloth. None of it belonged to an ordinary farm. His first recruit was his deputy, a 28-year-old named Thomas Callahan. Thomas was the son of Irish immigrants who had settled in the county 2 generations prior, and he carried in his blood that blend of courage and superstition characteristic of his heritage. When Brennan described what he had found at the Thornwood property, Thomas's green eyes widened, but he did not hesitate to volunteer for the expedition. The second man to join was the local blacksmith, a burly fellow named Heinrich Müller, who also served as the town's volunteer firefighter. Heinrich had hands the size of shovels and legendary strength, capable of bending horseshoes with his fingers when tavern bets demanded demonstrations. More importantly, he was known for unwavering courage and absolute loyalty to county authorities. The third team member was a less obvious choice. Dr. Nathaniel Crawford was the only physician within a 50-kilometer radius, a thin man with prematurely white hair and eyes that seemed to have seen too much suffering in his 61 years. Crawford had served as a surgeon during past conflicts and bore both visible and invisible scars from that experience. His presence would be essential should they encounter anything requiring medical expertise. The group set out late that same afternoon, equipped with kerosene lanterns, ropes, lock-picking tools, and loaded weapons. The sun was beginning to set when they reached the edge of the Thornwood estate, tinging the sky with shades of orange and purple that seemed inappropriately beautiful for the occasion. The crows were still there, watching from their sentinel perches, as if they had been waiting forever. Brennan led the group directly to the barn, ignoring the main house for now. The priority was to document and understand what he had glimpsed hours earlier. As they neared the structure, the odor the sheriff had noticed that morning intensified, now clearly perceptible to all. Dr. Crawford wrinkled his nose and murmured something about organic decay, but did not elaborate. There were things doctors learned to recognize without naming them aloud. Thomas Callahan was first to push open the barn doors, his lantern held high like a shield against the darkness inside. What the illumination revealed made all 4 men halt, absorbing the scene with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. The barn was larger inside than it appeared from outside, an architectural trick creating spatial disorientation. The structures Brennan had mistaken for cells were, in fact, a kind of makeshift labyrinth built from wooden planks and thick fabrics, dividing the space into interconnected compartments. Each compartment contained different objects, arranged as if exhibits in a disturbing museum. In the first compartment on the left, a collection of pocket watches hung from wall hooks, dozens of them, all stopped at exactly 3:15 a.m. In the next compartment, piles of shoes of various sizes and styles formed a silent mountain, some still bearing traces of dried mud on their soles. The third compartment held letters and documents yellowed with age, scattered across a table as if someone were mid-obsessive research. Heinrich Müller, despite all his strength and courage, felt his legs weaken when his lantern light illuminated the fourth compartment. There, hanging on makeshift clotheslines, were pieces of clothing of all kinds. Shirts, dresses, coats, hats. Dozens of complete outfits, like ghosts of people who had simply evaporated, leaving only their garments behind. Dr. Crawford approached the central table Brennan had spotted that morning. With hands trained not to tremble, he lifted the corner of the stained cloth and examined what lay beneath. His face remained impassive, but when he turned to the others, his voice carried a weight none had heard before. They were old surgical instruments, some Crawford recognized from his time as a field doctor. Others he had never seen in any manual or hospital. Alongside the instruments were notebooks filled with notes in tiny, obsessive handwriting. Thomas began to leaf through one of the notebooks, his young hands trembling slightly. The pages contained detailed anatomical drawings, diagrams of procedures that appeared medical, yet also seemed something entirely different, something conventional medicine would never condone. Dates were recorded throughout the notes, the most recent being only 8 days prior. Whatever Elias Thornwood had been doing in that barn, his activities had continued until very recently. Sheriff Brennan traversed the entire maze of compartments, mentally cataloging each discovery. Finally, he reached the famous back door, the one kept locked with heavy chains. The chains remained, but something had changed since the last time anyone from town had been there. The padlocks were open, hanging loosely, as if someone had left in a hurry without bothering to relock them. Brennan pushed the door open and discovered it led to a tunnel dug into the earth, a narrow corridor descending at a gentle angle to somewhere beneath the surface. The air rising from that hole was cold and damp, carrying an odor of ancient soil and buried secrets. The sheriff looked at his companions, saw the hesitation on their faces, illuminated by their lanterns, and made a decision. They needed to go down. They needed to discover where that tunnel led and what Elias Thornwood had built in the bowels of his property. The night would be long, and the discoveries were only beginning. The tunnel stretched for about 200 meters in a gradual descent that seemed to lead to the very heart of the earth. The walls were of compacted earth, reinforced at regular intervals by wooden beams that creaked under the weight of the soil above. The air grew thicker with each step, laden with moisture, and that peculiar silence that exists only in places sunlight never reaches. The 4 men's lanterns created flickering circles of light that barely pushed back the darkness. Sheriff Brennan led the way, his revolver in one hand and his lantern in the other. Close behind came Thomas Callahan, too young to completely hide the fear gleaming in his green eyes, but too determined to back down. Heinrich Müller occupied the third position, his corpulent mass filling almost the entire space of the narrow corridor. Dr. Crawford brought up the rear, his veteran surgeon's eyes cataloging every structural detail of the tunnel, as if assessing the stability of a critically ill patient. After what seemed like hours, but was likely only minutes, the tunnel opened into an underground chamber that elicited muffled exclamations from everyone present. The space was vast, much larger than any building on an ordinary farm. The vaulted ceiling rose at least 5 meters high, supported by stone pillars that appeared to have been carved with rudimentary tools, yet with obsessive precision. Extinguished torches were fixed to the walls at regular intervals, suggesting the place was frequently illuminated by something other than occasional lanterns. Heinrich lit some of the torches with matches from his pocket, and as the light grew, the chamber's details revealed themselves like a fever dream taking shape. The walls were covered in inscriptions, not the charcoal scribbles Brennan had seen in the barn above, but deep carvings into the rock itself. Symbols and figures none of the men recognized from any known tradition. There were spirals that seemed to move when observed for too long, humanoid figures in impossible poses, and sequences of markings that could be some form of ancient writing or simply the ramblings of a troubled mind. In the center of the chamber was a circular structure built of stacked stones, vaguely resembling a well, but with no visible water inside. Dr. Crawford cautiously approached and shone his lantern over the edge. The bottom was about 3 meters deep, and instead of water or earth, there was a smooth black surface that reflected light strangely, almost like a mirror made of obsidian or some similar material. Around the circular well, arranged in precise geometric patterns, were objects that told a silent and disturbing story. Candles consumed to their last centimeters, clay bowls containing dried residues of unidentified substances, bundles of herbs tied with red threads, and on the floor traced with what looked like salt or white powder. An elaborate circle filled with smaller symbols that connected the central well to the walls of the chamber like spokes of a macabre wheel. Thomas Callahan, who had stepped away to examine one of the side walls, called the others with an urgent whisper. His lantern illuminated a section where the inscriptions gave way to something different, a kind of mural painted with pigments that still retained vibrant colors despite the subterranean dampness. The painting depicted a sequence of scenes that seemed to narrate a story or ritual. In the first scene, stylized human figures were gathered around a circle similar to the one in the center of the chamber. In the second, one of the figures was in the center of the circle, arms raised toward something hovering above, something the artist had represented only as a mass of darkness with multiple eyes. In the third scene, the central figure had changed, its body elongated and distorted in ways that defied natural anatomy. And in the fourth and final scene, this transformed figure was alone. The other figures had disappeared and had walked toward a landscape vaguely reminiscent of the Ohio hills under a sky full of strange stars. Dr. Crawford studied the mural with the clinical attention he devoted to X-rays and laboratory tests. His scientific mind struggled to categorize what he saw, to find rational explanations in obscure religious iconography or the artistic ravings of a disturbed hermit. But there was something in the quality of those images, in the anatomical precision of the distortions depicted, that suggested knowledge rather than imagination. Whoever had painted that mural had seen something, or genuinely believed they had seen something they were trying to faithfully reproduce. Heinrich Müller, the most pragmatic of the group, was the first to verbalize what everyone was thinking. This was not the work of a single man working alone. The excavation of the tunnel, the construction of the chamber, the carvings in the walls, all of it represented years of work, possibly decades. Elias Thornwood had bought the property about 10 years ago, but this underground structure seemed much older. Either Thornwood had discovered something that already existed there, or he was simply the latest in a line of people involved in activities that none of those present could adequately name. Sheriff Brennan continued scanning the chamber, his lantern revealing recesses carved into the walls containing more disturbing objects. In one, there was a collection of glass vials containing liquids of different colors, some clear as water, others murky and dark. In another recess, stacks of notebooks similar to those found in the barn above, though these seemed older, with cracked leather covers and pages yellowed with age. And in a third recess, partially hidden by a thick fabric curtain, Brennan found something that made his blood run cold for the second time that day. It was a sort of makeshift altar, upon which rested an object wrapped in layers of cloth. The sheriff hesitated before touching it, some primal instinct screaming warnings in his mind. But his duty as a law enforcement officer prevailed. With fingers trembling despite his best efforts to control them, he pulled back the fabric and revealed what lay hidden beneath. It was a mask made of some material Brennan couldn't identify, pale as bone but supple as leather, molded into features that were almost human, but not quite. The eyes were empty holes, but around them were sculpted details suggesting multiple eyelids, as if the depicted face could open and close eyes in layers. The mouth was slightly open in a smile that conveyed no joy, only a kind of predatory knowledge. And on the temples of the mask, there were protuberances that could be atrophied horns or some kind of ritual adornment. Crawford approached and examined the mask with a doctor's eye. The material was neither bone nor leather, he concluded after a few moments of analysis. It was something organic, certainly, but nothing he could classify within his vast experience with human and animal anatomy. The texture was porous but uniform, and when Crawford brought his lantern closer, he noticed fine veins beneath the surface, as if that mask had once been part of something living. The group remained silent for long minutes, each man processing the findings according to his own capacity for understanding. What they had found transcended common crimes, transcended even the ordinary madness of murderers and maniacs who occasionally emerged in rural communities. This was something different, something that belonged to a category none of them had the vocabulary to describe. And somewhere out there, in the night that had already fallen over Ashland County, Elias Thornwood was still at large, privy to secrets that this subterranean chamber was only beginning to reveal. The decision to leave the underground chamber wasn't made with words, but with glances exchanged between the four men that said everything that needed to be said. The air down there had become too oppressive, heavy with a burden that went beyond the dampness and lack of ventilation. It was as if the walls themselves were watching, as if the symbols carved into the rock were the eyes of some ancient consciousness that didn't appreciate visitors. Sheriff Brennan was the last to climb up the tunnel, carrying with him some of the oldest notebooks he had found in the chamber's niches. His investigative mind knew that those documents might contain answers, or at least clues, about the nature of the activities that took place on that property. The rest of the evidence would remain untouched until he could organize a larger operation with more men and perhaps experts from outside the county. When they emerged into the barn, night had already completely consumed the day. Through the cracks in the wooden walls, they could see a moonless sky dotted with stars that seemed brighter than usual, as if the surrounding darkness were deeper. The group worked silently to temporarily seal the tunnel entrance, piling up abandoned boxes and farm equipment in front of the passage. It wasn't a barrier that would stop anyone determined, but at least it would signal if there was an intrusion. Thomas Callahan was assigned to remain on the property overnight, guarding the barn and main house from a safe position at the edge of the oak grove. The young deputy accepted the task without complaint, though his skin had visibly paled when Brennan made the request. Heinrich Miller offered his hunting rifle to supplement Thomas's service revolver, and Dr. Crawford left a bottle of medicinal whiskey, which he said would help keep the blood warm during the cold hours of the early morning. The other three returned to town in a silent ride, each lost in their own thoughts. The dirt road seemed longer in the dark, the shadows of the trees stretching across the path like fingers trying to grab the passing riders. Brennan kept his eyes fixed ahead, but his mind was on the notebooks he carried in his saddlebags, wondering what secrets those yellowed pages would reveal under the right light. They arrived in Ashland shortly before midnight. The town was asleep, with only a few windows still lit by the lamplight of nighttime inhabitants. The sheriff's office was on the ground floor of the town hall, a red brick building that represented the center of civil authority in the county. That's where Brennan went, leaving Heinrich and Crawford to go to their respective homes with instructions to maintain absolute silence about what they had discovered until a strategy was defined. Alone in his office, with only a kerosene lamp illuminating his desk, the sheriff began to examine the notebooks he had brought. The oldest had a date on the first page, 1847, written in an elegant handwriting that clearly did not belong to Elias Thornwood. The author identified himself only by the initials J.H., and his first entries described the purchase of a property in Ashland County for private research purposes. The following pages detailed an obsession that had consumed decades of this mysterious J.H.'s life. He wrote about legends of the region's native peoples, stories that spoke of places where the veil between the visible world and other planes of existence was thinner. According to his notes, the twisted oak trees that surrounded the property were not natural, but had grown that way due to the influence of something that existed beneath the earth, something the natives had learned to respect and avoid over countless generations. J.H. was not a man of empty superstitions. His notes revealed a methodical mind, almost scientific in its approach. He cataloged phenomena he had observed on the property: strange lights in the woods on certain nights of the year, sounds that seemed to come from beneath the earth, recurring dreams he shared with visitors who stayed overnight at the farm. Everything was recorded with dates, times, weather conditions, and star positions. It was the work of someone trying to apply method to the inexplicable. Construction of the tunnel and chamber had begun in 1851. According to records, J.H. had hired workers from outside the county, men who would come, work for a few weeks, and leave without asking questions. Excavation had revealed that something was already under the earth, remnants of even older structures that J.H. attributed to native peoples or perhaps to earlier civilizations that official history had not recorded. The central shaft with its base of black reflective material was already there when the workers reached that depth. J.H. had only built the chamber around it. The following notebooks covered decades of experimentation. J.H. described rituals he had reconstructed from fragments of knowledge gathered from diverse sources, old books acquired at European auctions, conversations with occult scholars in Boston and New York, and interpretations of symbols that already existed on the underground walls when he discovered them. His objectives were never explicitly stated, but the subtext suggested a search for forbidden knowledge, for answers to questions that conventional science refused to ask. J.H.'s last entry was from 1889 and consisted of only one enigmatic sentence. He had written that he was finally ready to cross the threshold and that he was leaving his records for whoever came after him, hoping that his work would not be in vain. There was no explanation of what crossing the threshold meant, nor any indication of what had happened to J.H. after that date. The property had apparently remained abandoned until Elias Thornwood acquired it in 1902, 23 years later. Thornwood's notebooks began where J.H.'s ended, but with a different tone. Where J.H. was methodical and almost academic, Thornwood was feverish and obsessive. His notes revealed that he had discovered the earlier records hidden in the main house and had dedicated years to studying them before resuming work in the subterranean chamber. Thornwood believed that J.H. had succeeded, that the man had, indeed, crossed some kind of threshold, and that the rituals left in the notebooks could be replicated. Sheriff Brennan read until his eyes burned with exhaustion, and the lamp began to flicker for lack of kerosene. What he had discovered raised more questions than it answered. Who was J.H., and what had happened to him? What did Thornwood hope to achieve by following in his predecessor's footsteps? And even more disturbing, the clothes, the shoes. The clock stopped at 3:15 in the morning. To whom did those objects belong, and where were their original owners? Morning found Brennan asleep at his desk, the notebooks scattered around him like petals of a dark flower. In his dreams, he wandered the corridors of the subterranean chamber, but the torches on the walls were lit, and the carved symbols pulsed with their own light. In the center, the circular well awaited, its black surface no longer reflecting, but absorbing, swallowing the light and perhaps much more. And from somewhere in the depths, a voice called his name with a familiarity that chilled his blood. Dawn brought with it a dense fog that crept through the streets of Ashland like a silent omen. Sheriff Brennan awoke with a sore neck, his mind still clouded by the disturbing dreams that had filled his few hours of rest. The gray light streaming through the office window revealed the notebooks scattered across the desk. Concrete evidence that the previous night had not been merely another nightmare. Before he could gather his thoughts, the office door burst open. Thomas Callahan stumbled in, his face as pale as wax, and his eyes wide with an expression Brennan recognized immediately. It was the look of a man who had seen something his mind struggled to process. The young deputy leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, unable to form words for long seconds. When he finally managed to speak, his voice emerged in broken fragments. He had remained on the Thornwood estate all night as instructed, watching the barn and the main house from his position at the edge of the woods. The first few hours had been quiet, just the oppressive silence and biting cold of a March dawn. But around 3 o'clock, something had changed. Thomas described lights that began to shine from inside the barn, not the orange light of lanterns or candles, but a cold, bluish glow that pulsed at regular intervals. He had gripped his rifle and approached cautiously, convinced that Thornwood had returned to the property. But when he peered through the cracks in the barn walls, no one was inside. The lights came from below, emerging from the tunnel they had partially blocked hours before. The boxes and equipment they had stacked were now scattered across the floor, as if something had passed through without regard for obstacles. The young deputy confessed that fear had gripped him at that moment. All his instincts screamed at him to flee, to mount his horse and gallop as far away as possible from that cursed place. But something kept him there. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps a sense of duty, or perhaps some less explainable influence. He remained watching as the bluish light grew in intensity until the entire interior of the barn seemed submerged in that supernatural glow. And then came the sounds. Thomas struggled to describe them, his words failing to capture the essence of what his ears had heard. They were like chants, but not in any language he recognized. Multiple voices intertwined in a harmony that seemed wrong, that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. The chants lasted perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps an hour. Time had lost its meaning during that period, and when they finally ceased, the light went out as abruptly as it had appeared, leaving only absolute darkness and a silence that seemed deeper than before. Thomas had waited until the first rays of sunlight illuminated the horizon before approaching the barn again. What he found inside made him mount his horse immediately and ride to town without looking back. The makeshift barricade they had built at the tunnel entrance was intact. Nothing had been moved. The crates and equipment remained exactly where they had been placed the night before. It was as if the events Thomas had witnessed had left no physical trace, no evidence that they had occurred outside of his own perception. Sheriff Brennan listened to the account with a mixture of concern and professional skepticism. His rational mind, wanted to attribute Thomas's experience to fatigue, cold, and the stress of a solitary vigil in a place laden with sinister atmosphere. But the notebooks on his desk told stories of similar phenomena observed and recorded by 2 generations of occupants of that property. If both the mysterious founder and Elias Thornwood had documented inexplicable events over decades, perhaps what Thomas had seen was not simply the product of an overactive imagination. The town of Ashland began to awaken around them as they talked, the sound of carts in the streets, the church bell marking 7 o'clock, the aroma of fresh bread wafting from the bakery across the square. The normalcy of daily life seemed almost obscene after the revelations of the last 24 hours. Brennan knew he needed to make decisions, but each available option carried risks he couldn't fully calculate. Telling everything to the mayor and the town council meant risking his reputation and possibly his job. Stories of underground chambers with strange symbols and supernatural lights were not the kind of report elected officials received with enthusiasm. On the other hand, keeping it secret meant leaving a potential threat unchecked, and if something happened to the county residents, the responsibility would fall entirely on his shoulders. Brennan decided on a middle ground. He would convene a discreet meeting with Heinrich Miller, Dr. Crawford, and a few other trusted men in the community. He would present the physical evidence he had collected, the notebooks, the strange mask, the disturbing objects found in the barn, and let each draw their own conclusions. If there was consensus that the situation required outside intervention, he would write to the state authorities in Columbus. Otherwise, they would organize rotating surveillance of the Thornwood property until Elias himself was located and questioned. The meeting was scheduled for that same afternoon in the back room of Samuel Hendrick's warehouse. The location offered sufficient privacy for delicate discussions, and Hendrick was one of the county's most respected citizens, whose presence would lend credibility to any decision made. Brennan spent the morning organizing the evidence and preparing a summary of the facts that could be presented logically, stripping the events of any language that sounded superstitious or alarmist. As he worked, his mind kept returning to the notebooks and the questions they raised. The property's original founder had dedicated over 40 years to that subterranean obsession before supposedly crossing some kind of threshold in 1889. Thornwood had continued the work for another 10 years, from 1902 to the present. Together, they represented over half a century of secret activities occurring beneath the soil of Ashland County, completely invisible to the residents who lived and worked just a few miles away. What else could be happening on the isolated farms and remote properties scattered across Ohio? How many other secrets lay buried beneath the seemingly peaceful land of that state? Brennan dismissed these thoughts with a shake of his head. He couldn't afford to speculate on hypothetical mysteries when he had one very real and very present to solve. Elias Thornwood was still somewhere, and until he was found, no definitive answer would be possible. The afternoon arrived laden with heavy clouds that promised rain before nightfall. One by one, the summoned men arrived at Hendrick's warehouse, entering discreetly through the back door to avoid drawing attention. In addition to those already involved, Brennan had included Reverend Jonathan Price, leader of the local Methodist congregation, and Justice of the Peace Albert Whitmore, a distant cousin of Margaret, the woman whose observations had initiated the entire investigation. These were men Brennan had known for years, men whose discretion and good sense he trusted. When everyone was gathered in the lamplit room, the sheriff began his presentation. His words were measured, factual, devoid of dramatization. He described the initial visit to the property, the discoveries in the barn, the descent into the tunnel, the subterranean chamber with its disturbing symbols and artifacts. He passed the notebooks from hand to hand, allowing each man to examine the notes for himself. And finally, he revealed the mask, removing it from a wooden box and placing it on the central table for all to see. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. The faces around the table reflected a range of emotions: disbelief, horror, morbid fascination, and something bordering on genuine fear. Reverend Price was the first to speak, his voice trembling slightly as he quoted biblical passages about abominations and forbidden practices. Judge Whitmore, more pragmatic, inquired about legal jurisdiction and what specific crimes could be attributed to Thornwood based on the available evidence. The discussion stretched on for hours, voices overlapping in increasingly heated debates about how to proceed. And outside, the first drops of rain began to fall on Ashland, as if the sky itself were weeping for what was to come. Rain battered Ashland County for 3 consecutive days, turning dirt roads into rivers of mud and isolating rural properties from one another. Sheriff Brennan used this forced pause to deepen his study of the recovered notebooks, delving ever deeper into the yellowed pages that told stories of obsession and buried secrets. The meeting in Hendrick's warehouse had ended without a unanimous decision. Reverend Price argued that the underground chamber should be destroyed and permanently sealed, claiming that certain knowledge was forbidden for divine reasons. Judge Whitmore, on the other hand, insisted on proper legal procedures, fearing that hasty actions could result in future legal complications. Heinrich Müller proposed simply burning the entire property to the ground, eliminating any trace of whatever none of them could adequately name. In the end, bureaucratic caution prevailed. Brennan would send a report to state authorities in Columbus, omitting the most inexplicable elements and focusing on the tangible criminal aspects, the suspicious collection of personal belongings, the signs of clandestine activities, and the owner's disappearance. While awaiting a response, discreet surveillance would be maintained on the property, with trusted men who volunteered for the task rotating the watch. It was during those 3 rainy days that Margaret Whitmore returned to see the sheriff. The woman appeared in his office on a particularly gray afternoon, her damp hair escaping from under her soaked hat, her eyes carrying that intensity Brennan had already learned to recognize. She had new information, she said, things she had remembered after learning of the discoveries on the Thornwood property. Margaret recounted that her family had lived in that region for generations. Her grandparents had been among the first settlers to establish themselves in Ashland County back in the 1820s, when Ohio was practically a wild frontier. She grew up listening to stories that the elders told around the fireplace on winter nights, stories she always dismissed as rural folklore meant to frighten the younger generation and keep them away from dangerous places. One of those stories spoke specifically about the land where the Thornwood estate now stood. According to the oral tradition Margaret had inherited, that place was avoided by the native peoples long before the arrival of European settlers. They called it by a name she couldn't pronounce correctly, but which meant something like the place where the earth breathes. The natives believed that certain regions possessed a stronger connection to forces that existed beyond human comprehension, and that hill surrounded by gnarled oak trees was one of those points of intersection. The early settlers ignored the warnings, as settlers often do. A man named Ezra Blackwood built a cabin there in 1831, drawn by the quality of the soil and the abundance of water from a nearby stream. Ezra lived on the property for less than 2 years before abruptly abandoning it, leaving behind all his belongings. When neighbors went to check what had happened, they found the cabin empty, the stove still with the remains of an unfinished meal, Ezra's clothes hanging on hooks as if he were about to return at any moment. Ezra Blackwood was never seen again. Some said he had fled from debt, others that he had fallen victim to wild animals or bandits. But the elders of the community whispered other explanations that involved the peculiar nature of that land and what supposedly inhabited its depths. Ezra's cabin eventually crumbled, consumed by time and vegetation, and the property remained abandoned for decades until a mysterious outsider acquired it in the mid-century. Brennan immediately recognized the connection. The mysterious stranger Margaret mentioned could only be the author of the oldest notebooks, the man with the initials who had built the underground chamber. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, revealing a story that spanned almost a century, a chain of events connected by that seemingly cursed piece of land. Margaret had more to tell. She had spoken with her great-aunt, a 93-year-old woman who lived in a nursing home in the neighboring town of Mansfield. The elderly woman, despite her advanced age, retained a surprisingly sharp memory for events from the distant past, and when Margaret mentioned the Thornwood estate, the old lady paled and made the sign of the cross, a gesture Margaret had never seen her make in her entire life. Her great-aunt recounted events that had occurred when she was a young woman, around 1880. At that time, rumors began circulating about strange activities on the property. Lights in the middle of the night, inexplicable sounds, visitors who arrived and were never seen leaving. The county sheriff at the time, a man named William Hartley, had conducted an investigation that ended abruptly and was never explained. Hartley resigned his post a few months later and moved west, refusing to speak about it for the rest of his life. Brennan frantically jotted everything down, his investigator's mind working to connect the threads of this increasingly complex web. The Thornwood estate wasn't just the site of suspicious activities of an eccentric hermit. It was the center of something much larger, something that spanned generations and seemed to exert an inexplicable attraction on certain people. The first mysterious occupant had arrived drawn by native legends. Thornwood had arrived drawn by the records left by his predecessor. And who would come next, drawn by what still unrevealed secrets? The rain finally stopped on the fourth day, leaving behind a washed-out, sparkling world under a sun that seemed excessively cheerful for the circumstances. Brennan decided it was time to return to the Thornwood estate, this time armed not only with lanterns and weapons, but with the right questions and the historical knowledge Margaret had shared. If the subterranean chamber held more secrets, he was determined to find them. Heinrich Müller and Dr. Crawford agreed to accompany him again. Thomas Callahan, still visibly shaken by the events of his night watch, asked to be excused from this expedition, a request Brennan granted without judgment. Not all men are made to face certain darknesses, and recognizing one's own limitations was a sign of wisdom, not weakness. The trio set off at dawn on the fifth day, the road still muddy but passable. The surrounding landscape looked different after the storm, greener and more vibrant, as if the rain had awakened something sleeping beneath the earth. The gnarled oak trees surrounding the Thornwood estate were beginning to sprout, small green buds emerging on branches that resembled arthritic fingers pointing to the sky. When they arrived at the barn, they found it exactly as they had left it. The makeshift barricade remained intact, contradicting Thomas's account of it having been dismantled the night of his vigil. Brennan didn't know what to make of this discrepancy. Either Thomas had imagined the whole thing, or something had restored the barricade after passing through it, which raised even more disturbing questions. This time, they came prepared for a more thorough exploration. In addition to their usual lanterns, they brought extra torches, ropes for marking the path, and notebooks to systematically document everything they found. Crawford also carried a primitive camera, hoping to capture images that could serve as more convincing evidence than mere verbal descriptions. They descended the tunnel in silence, each man absorbed in his own thoughts. The subterranean chamber awaited them exactly as before. The symbols on the walls, the central shaft with its dark, reflective surface, the niches filled with unsettling objects. But there was something different in the air, a subtle feeling Brennan couldn't immediately identify. It was as if the place knew they had returned and was waiting to see what they would do next. Systematic exploration of the chamber revealed details that had gone unnoticed on the first visit. Dr. Crawford, with his clinical attention to detail, was the first to notice that the symbols on the walls were not random as they first appeared. There was a logical progression to them, a sequence that began near the tunnel entrance and developed around the spiral chamber, converging on the central shaft like a river of meanings flowing into an ocean of mystery. Heinrich Müller documented everything with his camera, the magnesium flash briefly illuminating sections of the walls as he captured image after image. The process was slow and laborious, each photograph requiring careful preparation and precise positioning. But the blacksmith understood the importance of creating a permanent record, something that could be examined later by people with knowledge none of them possessed. Sheriff Brennan focused his attention on the nooks he hadn't fully explored on his previous visit. In one of them, hidden behind a thick fabric curtain that the dampness had practically fused to the wall, he found something that made his heart race. It was a kind of map drawn on old parchment with ink that had faded but remained legible. The map showed Ashland County and neighboring regions, but with strange markings in various places, symbols similar to those that decorated the walls of the chamber. Brennan counted the markings. There were 7 of them scattered across the map, including one that clearly corresponded to the location of the Thornwood property. The other 6 were distributed across different counties in Ohio, some in areas he recognized, others in remote regions he had never visited. If the map was accurate, it meant the underground chamber wasn't unique. There were other similar places, other spots, where whatever existed beneath the Thornwood land could also exist. Crawford approached to examine the map with his trained medical eye, discerning patterns in seemingly unconnected symptoms. He observed that the 7 markings formed a geometric figure when connected by imaginary lines, vaguely resembling a 7-pointed star, but distorted in a way that suggested a 3-dimensional projection viewed from above. If each point represented a location similar to Thornwood's chamber, the center of this geometric figure would fall somewhere in the heart of Ohio, perhaps near Columbus. The discovery raised implications that none of the 3 men wanted to fully contemplate. The idea that activities like Thornwood's could be occurring in multiple locations simultaneously transformed what seemed like an isolated case of dangerous eccentricity into something potentially much larger. There was a network there, a connection between places, and perhaps between people who shared knowledge and objectives that remained hidden from conventional society. As they processed these revelations, a sound made them freeze in their positions. It was a low, steady noise, like a vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. At first, Brennan thought it was his imagination, or perhaps the distorted echo of some natural phenomenon on the surface. But when he looked at his companions, he saw that they too had stopped, their expressions reflecting the same mixture of confusion and growing alarm. The sound gradually increased in intensity, revealing itself not as a single vibration, but as a superposition of frequencies that created a disturbing harmony. It was almost like music, but music that followed different rules than those the human ear was accustomed to processing. The notes, if they could be called that, seemed to move in impossible directions, rising and falling simultaneously, creating echoes of themselves before ending. Heinrich dropped the camera and gripped his lantern tightly, his wide eyes scanning the shadows around him. Crawford instinctively recoiled toward the tunnel entrance, his veteran surgeon's face visibly paling. Only Brennan remained where he was, paralyzed not by fear, but by a morbid curiosity he recognized as potentially dangerous, but couldn't resist. The sound seemed to emanate from the central well. The black reflective surface that had previously remained perfectly still began to ripple gently, like the surface of a lake disturbed by an invisible stone. The ripples propagated from the center to the edges and back, creating patterns that seemed to follow the rhythm of the strange music that filled the chamber. Brennan approached the well, ignoring Crawford's urgent whispers to back away. Each step seemed to require more effort than the last, as if the air around him were growing thicker. The light from his lantern flickered erratically, the flames battling some invisible force that seemed intent on extinguishing them. And when he finally reached the edge of the well and looked down, what he saw nearly made him lose his balance. The black surface was no longer merely reflective. There was depth there now, a depth that seemed to extend far beyond the 3 meters Crawford had measured on his first visit. It was like looking at an inverted night sky, a vertical abyss that defied geometry and logic. And in the depths of that abyss, something moved. It wasn't a defined form, more a suggestion of movement, a displacement of different darknesses within the greater darkness. The sheriff felt an intense dizziness take hold of his body. His hands gripped the stone edge of the well as his mind struggled to maintain sanity in the face of what his eyes insisted on showing him. The strange music reached a crescendo that made his teeth chatter, and for a terrifying moment, Brennan was absolutely certain that he was about to fall, that he would be swallowed by that impossible abyss and never return. It was Heinrich who saved him. The blacksmith strode across the chamber in 3 long strides, grabbed Brennan by the coat, and pulled him away from the well with enough force to drag an ox. The two fell to the stone floor as the music abruptly ceased, leaving a silence that seemed deeper than any silence they had ever experienced. When Brennan finally managed to sit up and look back down at the pit, the black surface had returned to its previous state, flat and still as an obsidian mirror. There were no more ripples, no more impossible abyss, no more movement in the depths. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the last few minutes had been just a shared delirium of 3 men exposed to stale air in an underground chamber. But the look the 3 exchanged confirmed that they had all seen the same thing. It wasn't delirium. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't the effect of subterranean gases on weary minds. Something had responded to their presence in that chamber. Something that existed beyond or below the world they knew. And now that this something knew they were there, that they had found its secrets, the question that hung in the air was what would happen next. Crawford was the first to verbalize what everyone was thinking. They needed to get out of there immediately. They needed to seal off the place and ensure that no one else descended into that chamber until they could better understand what they were facing, if it was even possible to understand something that seemed to exist beyond the categories of human comprehension. The ascent through the tunnel was made in tense silence, each man lost in his own thoughts and fears. When they finally emerged into the barn and saw the daylight streaming through the cracks in the walls, the relief was almost physical. The normal world, with its sun and fresh air and predictable rules, had never seemed so precious as at that moment. The days that followed the second exploration of the underground chamber were marked by a silent tension that hung over the men involved in the investigation. Brennan, Crawford, and Heinrich had made a tacit pact not to discuss what they had witnessed in the depths of the well, as if verbalizing the experience might somehow make it more real, more permanent, more impossible to ignore. The sheriff resumed his daily duties with an automatic ease that masked the turmoil in his mind. Routine patrols, minor disputes between neighbors, documents to sign, reports to file. The bureaucracy of the job offered an anchor of normalcy to which he clung with growing desperation. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the office was empty and only a lamp kept him company, his thoughts inevitably returned to that undulating black surface, to that impossible abyss, to that suggestion of movement in the depths. A week after the second expedition, a response finally arrived from Columbus. State authorities thanked Sheriff Brennan for his report and informed him that an investigator would be sent to assess the situation in Ashland County. The investigator would arrive in approximately 15 days, time needed to complete other commitments and organize the trip. In the meantime, they recommended that the Thornwood property remain under surveillance and that no definitive action be taken until the arrival of the state representative. Brennan received the news with mixed feelings. On the one hand, it relieved him to know that he would no longer be alone in carrying the weight of that investigation. On the other hand, 15 days seemed like an eternity when considering what could happen in that time. Surveillance of the property had been maintained as planned, with trusted men taking turns in 12-hour shifts, but none of them had reported any activity since the exploration team left. The silence of the Thornwood estate was almost more unsettling than the phenomena they had witnessed. It was as if the place were waiting, gathering strength, or perhaps simply watching to see what the intruders would do next. This feeling of being watched was shared by all the men participating in the surveillance, although none could identify where it came from or how to rationally explain it. On the 10th night after the second expedition, something finally happened. The watchman that night was a farmer named Robert Hensley, a robust man of 45, who had briefly served as a soldier in his youth and was not easily frightened. Robert was positioned at the edge of the oak grove, exactly where Thomas Callahan had stood weeks before, when he noticed movement in the direction of the main house. These weren't the strange lights Thomas had described. It was something more mundane, and therefore all the more alarming. A human figure had emerged from the darkness and was walking toward the porch of the house, moving with the familiarity of someone who knew the terrain well. Robert raised his shotgun and watched through the scope as the figure climbed the porch steps and entered the house through the front door, which apparently wasn't locked. The farmer faced a dilemma. His instructions were to observe and report, not to confront any intruder who appeared alone. But if the figure was Elias Thornwood returning to his property, letting him escape again could mean losing his only chance to get direct answers about what was happening there. Robert made a decision he would later describe as the most difficult of his life. He left his position and approached the house. The ground floor windows remained dark, but Robert could see a faint light moving on the second floor, as if someone were carrying a candle or lamp from room to room. He silently circled the house, searching for a position that offered a better view of the interior. He found what he was looking for in a side window that overlooked what appeared to be an office or library, its panes dusty, but not completely opaque. What Robert saw through that window made him question his own sanity. The figure inside was indeed a man, tall and thin, wearing dark clothes that seemed decades out of fashion. He moved around the room with precise gestures, taking books from shelves, examining them briefly, and placing them in a pile on a desk. So far, nothing particularly strange, but there was something wrong with the way the man moved, a quality that was too fluid, as if his joints bent at slightly different angles than normal. And there was his face. Robert only caught a glimpse of it for a few seconds as the figure turned toward the window. But those seconds were enough. The face was pale, excessively pale, with features that seemed almost normal, but not quite. The eyes were too large, or perhaps they only seemed large because of the way they reflected the lamplight, and there was a static quality to the expression, as if the facial muscles didn't quite know how to form convincing human emotions. Robert instinctively recoiled, tripping on an exposed root and falling backward onto the damp ground. The sound of his fall seemed to echo in the silent night like thunder. When he managed to get up and look back at the window, the light had vanished. The room was plunged into complete darkness with no sign of the figure he had seen moments before. The farmer didn't wait to investigate further. He ran back to the woods, mounted his horse, and galloped into town with a speed the animal had rarely been forced to reach. When he arrived at the sheriff's office shortly before dawn, he was trembling, not from cold, but from something deeper, a dread that had lodged itself in his bones and refused to leave. Brennan listened to Robert's account with an outward calm that belied the turmoil within. The farmer's description disturbingly coincided with certain passages in the old notebooks, passages that spoke of gradual transformations, of the price certain knowledge demanded of those who sought it. If the figure Robert had seen was Elias Thornwood, the man had changed in ways that went far beyond what simple seclusion and eccentricity could explain. The sheriff reassembled his trusted group that same morning. There was no more time to wait for the investigator from Columbus. Whatever was happening at the Thornwood property was accelerating, and each passing night could bring developments they weren't prepared to face. A decision needed to be made, and it needed to be made immediately. The discussion was brief and intense. Heinrich Müller repeated his proposal to burn the entire property, arguing that it was the only way to ensure that whatever was there could not spread. Dr. Crawford, ever the voice of caution, warned of the legal and practical consequences of such an action, as well as the risk that the fire might not be enough to destroy what was buried deep within. Reverend Price prayed softly in the corner of the room, his Latin words creating an odd counterpoint to the pragmatic discussions. It was Judge Whitmore who proposed an intermediate solution. They would not set fire to the property, but would permanently seal the tunnel entrance. They would use stones, concrete, whatever was necessary to ensure that no one else could descend into that chamber. As for the main house and the barn, they would be left intact to avoid legal issues, but the area would be declared off-limits for public safety reasons until state authorities could take over the case. Brennan agreed to the proposal. It was an imperfect compromise, but it was better than inaction or reckless destruction. The sealing work would begin that very day, before another night fell upon Ashland County and brought with it more mysteries that none of them were equipped to face. The sealing work began on a gray morning that seemed fitting for the task. Men from the county arrived at the Thornwood estate, carrying stones, mortar, and tools, their faces marked by a determination that concealed the fear they all felt. No one spoke more than necessary. Orders were passed in whispers, as if raising one's voice might awaken something better left sleeping. Heinrich Müller coordinated the efforts with the efficiency of someone who had spent his life working with resistant materials. Layer after layer of stone was piled at the tunnel entrance, each sealed with thick mortar that would dry, forming a nearly impenetrable barrier. The process took all day, and as the sun began to decline on the horizon, the passage to the underground chamber had completely disappeared, replaced by a solid wall that revealed nothing of what lay beyond it. Sheriff Brennan oversaw the final work in silence. Part of him felt relief at closing that chapter, at putting up a physical barrier between the normal world and the horrors they had uncovered. But another part, a part he preferred not to examine too closely, felt a strange melancholy. The questions the chamber raised would remain unanswered forever, buried along with the symbols on the walls and the black-surfaced well that seemed to contain infinities in its depths. As for Elias Thornwood, or the figure Robert Hensley had glimpsed on that unsettling night, no trace was found. The main house was searched from top to bottom, revealing no occupants. The books that had supposedly been stacked in the study were in their usual places on the shelves, covered by the same layer of dust that covered everything else. It was as if the nocturnal visit had never happened, or as if whoever had been there knew exactly how to erase their tracks. The recovered notebooks were stored in a safe in the sheriff's office, awaiting the state investigator who would arrive in a few days. The photographs that Heinrich had taken in the underground chamber were developed by a specialist in Mansfield, but the results were disappointing. Most of the images were blurry or overexposed, and the few that came out clear showed only ordinary stone walls, without any trace of the elaborate symbols that everyone had seen with their own eyes. The map with the 7 markings was studied extensively by Brennan in the following nights. He wondered about the other 6 points indicated, about what might exist beneath the earth in those distant places. Could it be that similar chambers were hidden throughout the state of Ohio, each guarding its own secrets, each visited by its own caretakers, over countless generations? The idea was too vast to contemplate, too disturbing to fully accept, but some truths needed to be left in the shadows from where they came. The Thornwood estate was officially closed off. Fences were erected around the perimeter, and warning signs were installed at regular intervals. Over time, vegetation began to reclaim what had been abandoned. Twisted oaks spread their branches over the silent house, weeds covered the paths, and nature did what it always does when humans turn away. It erased the traces of their presence, transforming the place into a secret, guarded by time itself. The residents of Ashland County eventually stopped talking about the cursed property and its mysterious occupant. New concerns arose. New stories filled the conversations in taverns and on farm porches. Sheriff Brennan served for another 12 years before retiring, taking with him memories he never fully shared with anyone. Heinrich Müller continued his work at the forge until the end of his days. But it was said he was never the same after that spring of 1912. Dr. Crawford moved to Cleveland a few years later, perhaps seeking enough distance to forget what he had seen deep in the Ohio countryside. And the chamber remained sealed, guarding its secrets behind tons of stone and mortar. The black-surfaced pit, if it still exists down there, continues to wait in absolute silence. The symbols on the walls continue to tell a story that no one else can read. And whatever moved in that impossible abyss, whatever responded to the presence of the intruders on that March night, remains in the depths, patient as only truly ancient things can be. Some doors once closed are better left that way. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. And some stories, like the one we just shared, serve only to remind us that the world is much stranger, much vaster, and much more full of shadows than we would like to believe.